It's not often that I prepare a message around this, but today's message is going to be about money, right? So every so often in the life of our church community, it's important that we talk about it, and today is one of those days. So thanks for coming. It's going to be a good time. And just a quick heads up, I thought what I'd do this morning, just to kind of get us into the flow, is I'm going to pass around a little card machine, and I've put a preset amount in it, and all you need to do when that little machine comes by is just swipe your card. That's all I need you to do this morning. Easy peasy, right? Just swipe your card as that little machine comes around. I'm kidding. I could see you. I could never get away with that one, right? And that's one of the things that in the life of Renew is we don't do a shakedown every Sunday. I have been into some church settings where they do an absolute shakedown and they want to empty you of every last penny that you have in your pocket, and they send around big buckets and stuff. We don't do that here at Renew. I don't know about you, but do you start feeling a little bit of tension on the inside when the topic of giving your money comes up in church? Anybody get a little bit of like, Yeah, thank you for your honesty. Thank you for your honesty. And I don't blame you, because we are living in a world today where there's so many doctrines out there, and one of them is the prosperity, they call it the prosperity gospel, and that has enabled really financial abuse, and it's enabled exploitation within many, many churches. It's really replaced a spirit-led generosity, right? Because people there's manipulation that goes on, sometimes even fear tactics, but most of all, you have this kind of give-to-get kind of prosperity being taught. If you give, God's going to give back to you. It's this give-to-get kind of mindset, and it treats God as a cosmic vending machine. So something that we have determined to do right from the start here at Renew was not to rob believers of the joy of giving from the heart, right? Our model here has always been, firstly, to trust God for our provision. That's the very first thing that we do here, is we trust God for His provision. And secondly, to teach what we learn from Scripture, which in truth is a real-world application of communal support for the church, communal support from the church that encourages participation and avoids legalism. Okay? So that's my intro. So if you've got your Bible, let's go to Luke chapter 12. Right? In Luke chapter 12, we're going to just look at a little parable here that Jesus taught. So if you want to follow along, I will have the slides on the screen as we go. So Jesus, in Luke chapter 12, is having an interesting conversation with his disciples, right? It's really, if you read through the entire chapter, you find that it's a really intense conversation going on over here. And really, the bottom line is Jesus is talking about the cost of discipleship. He's talking about the weight of being a disciple, right? A true disciple. So what Jesus is trying to convey here is, hey, you guys, you need to do what I teach you to do, right? You need to put these teachings into practice. You need to live like I live. If you're going to follow me, you need to do what I'm teaching you. You need to live like I live. You need to do these things, right? It's not just a matter of hearing, Jesus says at the end of the Sermon on the Mount. It's not just a matter of hearing, it's a matter of doing. It's a matter of doing. And so as Jesus is talking to his disciples, a crowd has gathered around to listen. And if you read the passage, you find that it's indeed a very large crowd. So Jesus is talking about discipleship. He's talking about how costly it is. And suddenly, from out of the crowd, a guy just shouts out. He just interjects. He interrupts. And I want you to see what he says here in verse 13 of Luke chapter 12. Luke says, someone in the crowd said to him, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me. Jesus is in a discussion, a serious discussion. And the guy goes, Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me. I mean, do you know anyone like this? You know what I mean, right? You're having a conversation. I mean, you're having a deep conversation. Maybe it's like a weighty conversation with someone, and then somebody else comes along And they need something answered. And they right in there. They don't care that you're having a conversation. They don't really care about what you're talking about. They just interrupt. They need their question answered. And so they just interrupt you. Does anybody know anyone like that? Yeah. I do too. People can be pretty rude at times, right? I mean, and you're like, seriously, man? I'm in a deep conversation over here. Can you please just get lost for a while? We might think that the same thing is going on over here. So Jesus responds here in verse 14, and he says, man, who appointed me a judge or an arbitrator over you? Who appointed me a judge or an arbitrator over you? Now, even though it seems rude to us, it's probably not as rude as we might think it is when we read through the passage. And here's why. Because in the ancient world, rabbis were actually given the authority to make decisions around these kinds of ideas. Does anybody know what it's called? It's called binding and loosing. It's called binding and loosing. Too many people mistakenly think that this verse in Matthew chapter 16, verse 19 is about spiritual warfare. Whatever you bind on earth is bound in heaven. Whatever you loose on earth is loosed in heaven. Actually, it's about authority to definitively decide matters of the law. You see, rabbis had the authority to interpret the Torah and make practical rulings for daily life. So they could decide on matters by either prohibiting them or permitting them, either binding them or loosing them. So this guy, even though it might seem rude to our kind of 21st century sensibilities, he's actually asking the right person the right question. Because he looks at Jesus and he sees, what does he see? He sees a rabbi. A rabbi. And I've got an issue here that needs deciding on. And so obviously he thinks to himself, well, this rabbi is going to be able to solve the issue that I have about the inheritance that my brothers received. Now, the assumption here is that the older brother was probably in the crowd. That's the assumption. The older brothers had received the inheritance. He's in the crowd with the younger brother. And the younger brother is asking Jesus, please tell my brother to share the inheritance with me. And the inheritance was probably land, right? Generally, that's what you inherited at that time. And land was very precious to the Jewish people. Living in that particular context, land was important. It was worth something, but not only that, people's lives were associated with it. So Jesus responds here, and he says, essentially, I'm not going to split you and your brother up over this kind of stuff. Right? I'm not here as just a rabbi who's going to be making decisions about stuff and possessions and basically damage your relationship. That's not why I'm here. And so Jesus says, who appointed me a judge or an arbitrator between you and your brother in this inheritance rift that's going on? And then listen to what Jesus says in verse 15. In verse 15, he says this. He says, beware and be on your guard against every form of greed. Beware and be on your guard. Be on your guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. Not even when you've got an abundance of stuff does your life consist of those possessions. So watch out. Be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Jesus is saying, pay attention. And really what he wants to do is he wants to get at the motivation behind the question, which is the danger of greed. The danger of greed. I don't think too many of us actually give enough thought or attention to what greed actually does to our souls. There's no life in greed. Right? Jesus says, not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. So what Jesus is really saying here is like, essentially, he's saying, well, you can if you want. You can if you want. You can search for life in your stuff, right? If you want to try and find life in the security of your money or your possessions, go right ahead. If you want to find life in the fact that, hey, I've got enough money here that it's just going to be okay. I've got all these possessions and stuff. I'm okay. I'm good. This is what's going to see me through. This is what's going to help my family and all the rest of it. Jesus is saying, you can do that. You can do that. Go ahead. But he says, I want to tell you something. He says, there's no life in that. There's no life in that. You're not going to find life in any of those things. It's lifeless. It's unable to give life to you. And not only do they not have life, but they can actually lead you to a place of bondage. That thing, or those things, or that wealth can begin to have a hold on you, lead you into bondage. And you see, this is what happens when we find ourselves in that kind of a place. When the danger of greed starts to infect our soul, it's like the talons, the talons of greed starts to kind of take a hold of you. And it robs you of life. It robs you of life. It doesn't give it. It's extraordinary to me how many people I know will go into unnecessary debt. There's necessary debt, right? If you're going to buy a house or something, we don't all have the money to go and buy it straight up, or even a motor vehicle. You've got to get a loan or you've got to get a mortgage and stuff. So there's at times, and it's okay when you're able to repay what you owe, what the payment is. But if you go and buy a house that's unaffordable for you, and it's a real stretch to be paying that off, well then that's unnecessary. You need to live within your means. The same with a motor vehicle, whatever it might be. But I have come across a lot of people in my life who will go into unnecessary stuff, unnecessary debt to get that stuff. Sometimes even to get things that they don't really need. Right? For the sake of the gadget, the latest Apple Watch or whatever it might be. Or, it's the new model. I got to get the new model, that motor vehicle, or that house. Like, no, I'm not happy with this house. I've got to have that house. Even the holiday. We got to have that holiday. Like, we're just going to get the credit card out, baby. Why do we do that? I'm also amazed living in Australia at how many times I've driven through suburbs, and I like to look around, and as I'm looking around, I see people's garage doors open. I'm amazed at how many houses I look into those garages, and I'm amazed at the stuff in the garage. It's just stuff. It's just packed. You can't even get a car into the garage. It's so full of stuff. I'm like, seriously? To me, that's like a bad use of money. I mean, that's not what the garage was built for, right? But in our world, I mean, I can't even go there, some garages I've seen. But so many people find themselves kind of, really, they're enslaved, and they can be in bondage and in debt. And you see, here's the thing. If our lusts and our greed for stuff overcomes us, it does not give us life. We cannot find life in that. We're just going to find bondage in it. And that is not what Jesus wants for us, right? And that's what he's warning us about over here. He's warning us about greed, right? And greed, here's the thing about greed. Greed is idolatry. It's idolatry. What's idolatry? The idea of idolatry is when we put something in the place of where God needs to be, where God belongs. We put something else in place of God, right? And so that other stuff is more important than God. We might say, God, yes, you're important, but actually, you're not as important as all of these things. I'm going after those things because that's where my affections are. That's what's going to get most of my attention. Not you, God, not your kingdom, but that stuff, because that stuff's more important in here than you are. That's idolatry. And in fact, you can figure out if you have idols in your life, if you start to ask yourself questions about what is motivating your decision making. What motivates your decision making? If your decision making is motivated by God and by His kingdom, then I would say that should tell you that God's got your highest affection, right? God is God. If your decision making is motivated by God, you first, I'm going to honor you first, then I would say that God has the highest affection in your life. But if your decision making is based around all of these other things and God's kind of nowhere in the picture, then maybe you have to ask, where are my affections? Where are my allegiances? It's highly likely that it's something other than God. Greed is idolatry. Here's what the Apostle Paul has to say about this in Ephesians chapter 5. Verse 5, he says, "For this you know with certainty, that no immoral or impure person or covetous man, right, who is an idolater, has an inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God." You can know this with certainty. If there's covetousness, it's going to lead to idolatry. You have no inheritance in the kingdom of Christ and God. And here again in Colossians chapter 3, Paul says, "Therefore consider the members of your earthly body." In other words, consider yourself as dead to immorality. Consider yourself as dead to impurity. Consider yourself as dead to passion. Consider yourself as dead to evil desire. And consider yourself dead to greed, which amounts to idolatry. Right? When we baptized Sean last Sunday, what a beautiful baptism, right? And part of the baptism is to say, God, I'm leaving the old stuff behind. I'm going to do it your way. I want to truly be that new creation that you want me to be. So I leave behind that old life. I'm going to walk in your ways, right? That's right, Sean. And we'll be checking in on you, right? Because that's what we do as brothers and sisters. We put our arm around one another and we say, how's it going in your life? How's Jesus in you today? Is he there? Is the Spirit of God there? Or is there nothing there? That's why we do life in community. There's no such thing as a believer who's not in community. Community is vital to being a follower of Jesus, right? And so when we commit to following him, then we say to ourselves, well, this stuff that is so easy for me to slip into, immorality, impurity, passion, evil, desire, and even greed, which amounts to idolatry, I'm going to die to all of that stuff. But the point is, with Paul over here, he's saying that greed, it amounts to idolatry, amongst these other things. And so what Paul's doing is he's picking up on the teachings of Jesus here, right? That greed is an idol. Greed is going to lead you to false living. And hey, guess what? It ain't going to end well. It's not going to end well. Whew. This is something that we all have to actually deal with, truly. Hey? Right? We all have to deal with this. And that's why I think it's something that God, through Scripture, warns us to pay attention to. Greed, envy, all these kinds of things, covetousness. You say, well, why is this? Why has God, made this so important? And I think it's because he knows. In fact, I don't think I know. He knows. He knows. Especially when it comes to money and when it comes to possessions and when it comes to wealth, that the temptation here is that stuff can end up shaping our hearts. Can shape our hearts. Can become more important to us. And when that stuff becomes more important to us, it can lead us ultimately to forsaking him. To forsaking him. So covetousness, greed, envy, all of this stuff, it's very much a heart issue. So what does Jesus do? He identifies the issue, greed, right? And then he tells this little parable to the crowd. Let's just read from verses 16 through to 21. Jesus says, you got this rich man, and the land that he has is very productive, right? And this rich man begins to kind of reason with him. He starts to have a self-conversation. Do you ever have a self-conversation? You ever have that kind of going on with yourself? I mean, it's not a sign of madness, but we all do it. Maybe it is a slight sign of madness, I don't know. But we have this conversation with ourselves. This is the guy. He's got this land, it's very productive, and he begins to reason. He begins to have a conversation with himself. What am I going to do? What am I going to do? I don't have enough place to store everything. My garage is full. I don't have enough place to store, all of the harvest from the crops. And then he says, yes, I got it. This is what I'm going to do. I know what I'm going to do. Yes, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tear down all the old barns. Yes, I'm going to build larger ones. I am going to build bigger barns. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to be able to store all of my grain and all of my goods. I can get those big tractors in there. I can get everything in there. It's going to be that's what I'm going to do. I've got a plan. And I'm going to say to myself, man, I've done well. I'm going to say to my soul, man, I'm good. I've worked hard and I've got all this stuff. I'm going to say to my soul, you've got so many goods laid up. Man, you are secure. You're secure. You don't have to worry about all those other people. You're good. You're secure. Right? You've got many goods laid up for many years to come. I've got stocks and bonds and properties. I'm good. Many years to come, man, I'm okay. Hey, you know what? Let's just take it easy. Hey, bro, let's eat and drink and be merry. We're going to take it easy here. And God goes, you fool. You fool. This very night, your soul is required of you. You fool. What have you done? You know what you've done? Is you've forsaken God. You've taken off after all of these other things, and this is what's filled. This has become the highest priority in your life. You've forsaken God, you fool. You fool. If you were following God, you might have known, you might have had an inkling. This very night, your life is required of you. And now, who's going to own all that you've prepared? What a parable. What a parable. And Jesus ends here in verse 21. He says, this is what it's like for the person who stores up all of this treasure for themselves and is not rich towards God. Interesting line, hey? This is what it's like for everybody who goes after all this stuff and is not rich towards God. It's a really powerful story, and it's actually quite self-explanatory, isn't it? Here's this guy, and all the way through the parable, he's saying, I, myself, me, I, me, I. That's all you hear. And the Bible actually says that it's the land that's productive. Yes, the rich man might have been able to farm the land, but he couldn't make the land productive. The land was productive. It's almost a reminder that God is the source of everything. God is the one who provides all these things. It's God who makes the land productive. And the reason why this guy is rich is because God has allowed you to take profit from the land which is produced for you, right? God is the source of it all. So often we forget that fact. We have a job, we have money, we have finances and all that stuff, and we don't think of God anywhere in the equation. We don't think that the source of it all is God. So here's this rich guy. I mean, he's already rich. He already has these big barns to store all of his stuff. And he's saying to himself, well, what am I going to do? What am I going to do? I've got all this stuff, you know? And he starts to have this conversation with himself. He doesn't have a conversation with God. He doesn't go to God, God, what would you have me do? You've blessed me, so what would you have me do? No, he begins to have a conversation with himself. He doesn't even have a conversation with godly people, right? The scripture says there's wisdom in the counsel of others. He doesn't go to some godly people and say, can you give me some wisdom over here? He doesn't even do that. No. It's me, myself. Just has a conversation with himself. Self, what should I do? Self, what should I do? Got it. I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to tear down these barns and I'm going to build bigger ones. Great idea. And that's basically the conversation that he's having with himself. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. I'm going to tear down the barns. I'm going to build bigger ones. And if we had to go and ask this guy, why are you doing that? Why are you doing that? You know what he would say? Because I can. Because I can. And God says, oh, you're going to go off and you're going to build this and you're going to keep all of this stuff and you're just going to kick back and life's just going to be great. And God says, you're a fool. You're a fool. And you know why? Because tonight you are going to die. This very night, your life is going to come to an end, and who's going to get it all? You decided that your sufficiency was in your stuff. You thought that your life could be found in your stuff. And God's saying, you've forgotten about me. I am the only one who controls all things. I am the one who controls the narrative, whether you realize it or not. And so Jesus makes this point really clear in the story. But the amazing thing over here is that Jesus doesn't just give us a warning, he also gives us some hope here to move forward, right? Here in verse 21 at the end of the story, Jesus says, this is how it's going to be for whoever kind of stores up all of these things for themselves and is not rich towards God. Essentially, you're going to be a fool because you don't know how long you have. You don't know the length of your days, right? And so it's a foolish thing to do if you go off after all this stuff and you're not rich towards God. And so Jesus essentially is saying here in verse 21, he's saying, hey, instead of storing up all of this stuff, be rich towards God. Be rich towards God. So Jesus is saying that the money and the stuff that we have, we should use to show that we value God, that we value Jesus, that we value His kingdom more than we value the money-driven culture that we find ourselves in. We should use what God has blessed us with to show that we value Him. Now, can we actually enrich God? We can't, right? We can't enrich God, right? God really has no need of your Australian dollar. He doesn't even need the US dollar, right? He's not interested. He's not interested in all of your possessions and stuff. Yes, your money and your possessions can be used for His purposes, but you cannot give them to God in a way that's going to enrich God. So the point is that He doesn't actually need anything from us. Really, He wants something for us. He doesn't need anything from us. He wants something for us. So to be rich towards God is God's way of helping us to understand what our heart needs. Not what He needs, but what our heart needs to be rich towards God. And this is in part why God taught His people, Israel, to tithe. It's not because God needed anything. It's because their souls needed to learn a lesson about having no other gods before them. This is part of what God was doing. And tithing, when it comes to the Torah, it's not straightforward. It's actually really complex. It's not a straightforward single kind of tenth or 10% rule, right? A lot of people, when they talk about tithing, they just kind of assume that God requires the straightforward, like 10% of our income, and I've got to give 10% of my income to the church. That's not what the Scripture's saying. If you go into the Old Testament and you begin to read through what the Torah teaches about tithes, you find a bunch of different giving that had to happen. Like there were like 3 distinct tithes at least. And they all had their own purpose and timing. So let's just have a look at some of them over here. You have in Numbers chapter 18 the Levitical tithe. Who knows who the Levites were? Okay, the Levites were one of the tribes of Israel. Who knows who the Levites were? Okay. And what was the role of the Levites? Priests, that's right. And did the Levites receive an inheritance when they went into the promised land? Why? Don't rush ahead of me, Dane. How do you know I was going to say that? That's exactly right, by the way. It's perfectly right. But the reason why was because the Levites served in the tabernacle and in the temple. So they were there to facilitate the worship of God. They didn't receive an inheritance. And so what does God do? God puts in place the Levitical tithe. And so He says all the other tribes have to support the priests who serve here in the tabernacle and eventually in the temple. They had no land inheritance. Who knows who the Levites were? Okay, you should by now. And then the next one here that we see is the festival tithe, right? We see this all the way in terms of bringing an offering. Like, certainly God says at least 3 times for the feasts, the men need to be there. God's really specific. He says the men need to be there, and woe betide those men if they don't bring an offering, right? So there's a festival tithe. We read about this in Deuteronomy 14. And so the festival tithe was used for celebratory feasts and for worship in Jerusalem when all the people came for the festivals, so that the people could rejoice before the Lord. So we see the festival tithe, we see the Levitical tithe, and we see in Deuteronomy 14 as well the poor tithe. The poor tithe collected every 3rd year. Well, why did they collect from the people for what was this poor tithe all about, all this money? Well, it was to care for the widows and the orphans and the foreigners amongst them and the needy in their community. So altogether, when you start looking at tithe in the Old Testament, it could actually amount to, in any given year, significantly more than just 10% giving, right? And really what it functioned as was a national system of worship support and social welfare. And your tithing was tied to your agricultural produce, your livestock from your land. It's very different to today. How many of you tithe on your vegetable patch? Anybody got a goat or a sheep in the garden that you tithe on? So it's different in our circumstances, so we've got to move ahead and understand where our resources come from when it comes to today. But that was then in ancient Israel. And God says of the tithe in Leviticus 27, he says it's holy. It's holy to the Lord. And in Malachi chapter 3, God says failing to bring it is robbing me. Right? So failing to bring the tithe is described as robbing God. Yet even in the Old Testament, aside from all of these Mosaic laws, we see these examples of voluntary giving that go beyond instruction to just heart attitude. It's just the heart attitude. If you think of Abraham's tithe to Melchizedek in Genesis 14, or Jacob, I love Jacob's vow. Have you ever read it in Genesis 28:22? Jacob vows, after seeing the staircase with the angels, he vows to give 1/10 of all that God has given to him. This is even before Moses comes along. Jacob's already, I'm going to give you 1/10 of all that you give me. You see, the principle underneath it is this: everything belongs to God. And we are stewards. We are not owners of what we have. We are merely stewards of it. And so what God is trying to teach his people Israel, is to have him, God, as their highest allegiance. That's what he's teaching them. I must be your highest allegiance because that's what's going to be best for you. If you put me first, that's what's going to be best for you. And I'm going to bless you. If you're obedient to me, I will bless you. But his blessing of Israel would also be how he would demonstrate his glory to the nations who surrounded Israel. The nations who Israel was supposed to reach. The nations would be looking at the blessing of Israel and go, I want your God to be my God. And so God's teaching Israel, and he says, I want to be your highest allegiance. I want to be your highest priority. So follow through in what I'm instructing you to do. And then it'll be the best for you. And the nations will see my blessing upon you. And then they may turn to me. You don't believe me? You don't know? Trick question? Let's look at this passage here in Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 and 23. You shall surely tithe all the produce from what you sow, which comes out of the field every year. You'll eat in the presence of the Lord your God at the place where he chooses, the tabernacle, the temple, to establish his name, right? The tithe of your grain, your new wine, your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and your flock. So you're going to tithe all of this stuff so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. So that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. Do you see the point behind it here? What God's saying over here is that I want you to learn what it means to revere me. Jesus comes along and Jesus does not abolish the Torah requirements for Israel. But what Jesus makes really clear is that external obedience, like just following it for the sake of following it, external obedience without a heart change, where there's a love for God, a heart for justice, a heart for mercy, and all of these things, he says if it's just an external obedience and there's no heart change, then it's missing the point. And what we see developing amongst the Gentile communities in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul, remember, he's the apostle to the Gentiles, the nations. He's the Jewish apostle to the nations. And so when we read through the New Testament, we find that Paul's established all of these communities. Many of them have Jewish followers of Jesus, but they're also reaching the Gentiles, and in some places there are more Gentiles than Jews in these communities. That's what we read in the New Testament. And so Paul comes and he doesn't establish giving as a tithe, like a strict 10%. Instead, what we see in these communities is an emphasis on generous and cheerful giving. So we see these principles here in the New Testament of being generous and cheerful in our giving. So let's just have a look over here. In 1 Corinthians 16, verse 2, when we give in keeping with our income. We support those who preach the gospel. 1 Corinthians 9 and 1 Timothy 5. We support those who preach the gospel. 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, Galatians chapter 6. We care for the poor and the work of the church. In 2 Corinthians 9, verse 7, we give from the heart and not under compulsion or guilt. So these are the principles that we begin to see being established in these new communities, these followers of Jesus. Here's what Paul says to Timothy. This is 1 Timothy chapter 6. He says, instruct those who are rich in this present world. Who's rich here today? Some of you are not so sure, right? You wouldn't judge you wouldn't say you're rich. I'm telling you, you're rich. Do you know how I know that you're rich? You live in Australia. If you had to do a comparative analysis on your situation by the standard of many other people around the world, you are rich. You are very rich. You may find it difficult. You may have to juggle and all that kind of stuff. But let me tell you, take a step back and see what God's blessed you with. What are you doing with what God's blessed you with? Paul says here to Timothy, instruct those who are rich in this present world. Who's rich in this place? I see the message hasn't got through, but that's okay. Maybe it's that conceited word. I don't know. He says, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches. Man, don't we live in a world where people fix their hope on riches? And Paul says, tell them not to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God. Fix your hope on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. And then Paul says, instruct them to do good. Instruct them to do good works, right? To be rich in good works. To be generous, right? And ready to share. Storing up for themselves not a bigger barn, but storing up for yourself the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. Storing up for yourself a good foundation for the future. What did we celebrate last Sunday? The resurrection. Why is it important for you and me? Because if you are a follower of Jesus here this morning and you've given your life to Him, one day you too will be resurrected. That's why. He's the first fruits. He's gone before us. And He said, whoever follows after me will also be risen from the dead, will also have resurrected life. And there's going to come a time when all things will be set right by our Lord and King. And we want to be with Him in that world. Right? And so what he's saying over here is stop messing around with all of this stuff over here. Yes, you've got to live in all of that stuff, but if you're honoring God, then you need to begin to think about that, the resurrected life. And so you need to store up treasures for the future. That's what he's saying. Store up for yourself the treasure of a good foundation for the future. Make an investment in what is to come. Treasure for the coming age, not treasure for the now. You see, Paul is taking the words of Jesus here and he's expanding them. So he says, so that we can take hold of the life that is truly life. Who wants to be there? Who wants to have that life? He says that's where life is actually found. You're never going to find life in your stuff, in your possessions. Never. Create a foundation, man. You want to know a good investment? Start thinking about God first. God, where do I do this? I want the foundation here. How do we do that? How do we do that? How do we do that in light of this biblical community that we're part of? Renew. How do we do this? Well, generosity is a heart issue, right? It's a heart issue. It's not about checking numbers. It's not about checking percentages. Really, that's not what it's about. It's about doing these things that Jesus has asked of us. So for sure, you will hear me talking about the tithe. And I use Jacob as an example. Like, God, I'm just going to give a tenth back from what you've given me. So we can take the historical tithe. We can do that. We can take that historical standard of giving and we can use the 10% as a guide in terms of how we plan to honor God and in terms of how we support the ministry of our church. But I'd also say to you this morning, if you're unable to do that, at least start with something. At least start with something. And remember, the whole 10% thing, really, that's just a floor. It's not a ceiling. It's just a floor. If God has enabled you to give way more than that, then listen to the voice of the Spirit and act on the instruction of the Spirit. And I'll also just say this morning, we've got to be really careful because there's some folk in biblical communities who kind of excuse themselves from giving because we're under grace. It's just the grace of God. Now, this is not required of me. But folk, all I'm trying to convey here this morning is that God knows our hearts. He knows our hearts when it comes to this thing called money. And so when it comes to our money, really the only way to have a deep and reverent awe and profound respect for God's holiness and His power and His love and to combat greed is through generosity. And Jesus thought that it was a big enough deal to warn us. He said, watch out, be on your guard. So you may remember if you were here last February, who was here back in February last year? Maybe you were at that service. I shared a 5-year vision kind of vision for our church. I went through some points around a 5-year vision for Renew. And we have 3 strategic priorities. So let me just quickly remind you of these 3 strategic priorities. The first thing that we have said as a leadership team is that we want to see individual growth in our church, right? We want to see spiritual growth and discipleship so that we can become who God has intended us to be from the very beginning. God wants relationship with us, right? God wants deep communion with us. And so we want to see that happening in people's lives. And so we see a church where everyone is growing in their faith, where we are being equipped as disciples in our journey to Christ-likeness. This is what we're working on really hard within our church community. And we're not going to catch everybody because everybody's got to voluntarily come to the point of saying, I'm going to be a disciple. But we want to be committed to growing people, right? Individual growth. Spiritual growth. And then the second priority here is church growth. We want to see this church grow, right? We want to see the numbers of this church grow because we want to see the fruit of the gospel message going out. So we choose to see this church through the eyes of Christ, a devoted, biblically functioning community, right? Body and bride, growing in numbers across generations. And you will have heard me say this time and time again. We don't want to be a certain generation. We want to be like from birth to death, man. We want to see the whole lot coming through this church. And we want to see in those generations, those numbers growing in our church community. And then our third strategic priority is around financial stewardship. And so I want to just hang on this for a moment here because we want a church, we want to see this church discovering really the joy of giving. And we want to see that being carried out realistically and proportionately. So we've put this one out there. So let's just leave that up there for a moment or two. Can I ask you to think for a moment? Can you just stop for a moment and think? What would it look like for Renew to have its own church space? What would that look like? I'm hugely grateful. I'm hugely thankful that we have, God has provided for us at St. Stephen's. We are indebted to them. We're thankful for what they have done for us. We are hugely grateful for that. But obviously it's come with complications over the years. The building where sometimes we'd rock up on a Sunday and the place would be filled with stuff. We'd have to clear it out, and it's added stress. And every Sunday actually having to set up and set down, and the stress on the guys and their beautiful hearts, the volunteers, trying to get the sound right and get the instruments right. It's not easy just to go, boom, it's there. But those who volunteer to make that happen, man, we should be so grateful. It's complicated. Even this week, last week, a handful of us going, let's just grab what we can and get it across to this building, The complications, we're going to be thankful for the air conditioning. Absolutely, we're grateful. We're thankful for that. But just imagine. Can I just ask you to imagine if you were there last Sunday and Friday? If we began to see numbers like that, like last weekend on a more regular basis. It was heaving. Just under 200 people last Sunday morning. Well, then something has to be done about a more suitable venue. What's the first thing we need to do here? Pray. 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 That's okay. That's a good answer. But the first thing is we need to pray. We have to commit the matter to prayer, right? And when it comes to prayer, we've got to be diligent in that prayer. We've actually got to say, God, hear my heart for my church, for my community. We've got to be decisive about that in our prayer. And we actually have to begin to ask God about how we do that, right? So it's going to require money. It's going to require money. Now, when we started, who knows when Renew started? Alan? 5 years ago. November 2020. And when we started, a handful of people came together, and maybe it was a bit more than a handful, and we just began to get together. Do you know that Renew had not 1 cent? It didn't have anything. We had to come up with a temporary solution for those who decided that they wanted to give. And I've been slayed by how faithful God has been to this endeavor. God has been so faithful, it kills me, it breaks my heart just to see the goodness of God, because we stepped out and said, God, we just want to do something for you. And God's been faithful, and forgive me. But if it wasn't for your generosity, if it wasn't for what you've given to this church to fund our ministry and to fund the operations, it costs money. We don't sit here for free. We pay by the hour here. We rent a venue in Joondalup so that we can use that space between Sundays, and it's used. And we have insurances and all kinds of things, and you think that it just happens. It costs money. I'm so deeply thankful. And maybe why I'm really bawling is because we've tried to steward our finances in such a way that we can save wherever we can. We don't get a huge amount of income coming into our church, and we pray that we would see that increase as people's hearts begin to go, I want to get behind what God's doing here. And so I want to give a portion of what God's blessed me with. I'd love to see more people doing that. But we've been able to save. And at present, we have $380,000 in savings. That's what we've been able to put aside. Now, there's a plan to that, right? There's a purpose. It's not just for the sake of saving. It's because we want to go, God, what do you want? What's your will here? And what we've said with this money is that we're going to utilize it for a building, but if God had to come and say, you need to give this to some ministry and wherever, we will be faithful to what God asks us to do. If we've got to give all of that away, then we'll give it away as a church community. We want to walk in step with the Spirit of God. But that's what we have. But my question here really is, if we want to seriously do something about having a dedicated space for our community, we're probably, at the rate things are going, we're going to need at least as a floor, at least $1 million to $1.5 million to begin to even think about doing something. The suburb that I live in, a year ago, houses were selling for 600 and something thousand. Today, they're selling at 1.2 million. It's insane. Nothing's impossible with God, though. But we're going to need at least a chunk of money. The banks do not give churches mortgages like we could get a mortgage for a house. It's more like 50% of the cost is what they will help fund. So I was just thinking, like how would we do that? And so I thought, okay, let's just take 100 people, for example. 100 people. And I thought, I'll just play it around. I thought, how long would it take us if we had 100 people who what would they have to give every month? And how long would it take us to get to 1 million? And this is just, I'm just playing here, right? So $167 a month from 100 people would get us to 1 million in just under 5 years. If people had to give like maybe 200, it's almost a year less. 250, it's almost another year less. But it'll be a commitment. And this could be broken down in many ways, but I'm just using it to illustrate a point. Is something like this possible? I don't know. But I think that if we want to see what's possible with God through this church community, I don't think we can take a step back from it. I think we have to face it head on and say, we can't run away from this. We can't take a step back. We want to continue to be generous. We want to see God's work and maybe even God expand our generosity as a community. And so we're beginning to take some steps forward here. Our eldership team have agreed that we're going to start a separate fund for a home for Renew. And so our very first starting point here is to create a completely separate bank account which will be dedicated to a fund for a future home for our church. And that fund, we're going to, whatever people might invest in it, and it'll be in the newsletter, we'll give that out in the next few weeks. We're just going to take those funds and we're going to invest them for the best returns that we can get in order to get to an amount that's sufficient to help us secure a home for Renew. God willing. God willing. Now, here's why I'm telling you this. It's firstly to update you on one of the strategic priorities here that we have in our 5-year vision. But it's also as a reminder that we as a body corporately together are trying to steward and live under the same things that Jesus teaches us to do individually. We want to be people who are generous so that the world will know that our God is a generous God and that we live our lives in such a way that that is the case. Long ago, a guy interrupted Jesus with a question about his inheritance. And Jesus responds with a teaching that shows us that God is the only inheritance that gives life. We're not going to find life in stuff. We're not going to find life in greed. We're not going to find life in money. We're not going to find life in idols. We are only going to find life that is truly life in God. And so we can't talk about generosity without talking about the nature of who God is in his very essence. And for us to be a people who are being transformed into his image means that we're going to be that kind of people. God is a generous God, so may we be a generous people. So why don't we show the world in our lives individually and as a church corporately, why don't we show the world, or at least keep showing the world, that God is the only inheritance that gives life? God, not greed. God, not money. God, not possessions. God, not stuff. God, not idols. God is the only inheritance that gives life. So why don't we trust him? Why don't we trust him? Let's trust him in this life so that we can secure that foundation for the next. Let's trust him in this life when it comes to the stewarding of our money and our possessions. And let's act. When the Spirit of God whispers in your ear, that's what you need to do. Act on what the Spirit of God is asking you to do. Let's just be a people who are intentional about moving into the life that God has for us. Because Jesus has warned us, be on your guard against every form of greed. But he's also given us a path forward to be rich towards God. So let's take him at his word. Do you want to stand with me? We're going to close with in prayer this morning. Heavenly Father, I'm just so grateful this morning for what you have done in the last 5 years with this community of people. And I pray, God, that as people honor you, that they will see your blessing in their life in a myriad of ways. So that as Chi reminded us of this morning, the people who don't know you might see in us something very different. That they might ask questions about our God because of the peace that we have, the contentment that we have, the way we live our lives. Thank you again, Lord, this morning that everything that we have is yours. And I would ask this morning that you would forgive us. Forgive us, God, for those times that we've given grudgingly, and forgive us when we've held back. Teach us, Lord, to understand what it means to give as your Spirit leads us. Teach us the joy of cheerful, generous giving. Open our hearts and our hands, Lord, to support your work and to care for those who are in need. And may our giving may it bring glory to you. And I pray that in the name of Jesus. Amen.